Hello, this is Paul Benjamin Lowry. This video slide series is a continuation of the PhD student presentation series. And this time I'm pleased to present Cam Kormylo, who gives an outstanding presentation entitled Multiparadigm Perspectives and Meta-Triangulation. I will, as usual, give a brief shout out to Cam and give more information about him, followed by his presentation and a bibliography of the sources that he has so cogently summarized and put together.
Hi, everyone. So I will be presenting a couple of papers today. We're going to start by talking about a multi-paradigm perspective on theory building. And then we're going to talk about a methodology that kind of deals with these multi-paradigm perspectives called meta-triangulation. So before we start, I want to, I want to go over a couple of definitions that I think are going to be important to understanding these concepts. So the first is a paradigm. And a lot of these definitions, we know, but I just want to kind of reiterate and contextualize them for the topic that we're considering. So what we mean by a paradigm is a general perspective or way of thinking. So where someone is coming from, what their fundamental beliefs are, and what assumptions they're making about, organizational structure and behavior when they're creating these theories. The second definition, something that we've defined so many times throughout the semester, is theory itself. So the definition that these papers put forward is any coherent description or explanation of your phenomena of interest. So this is a little more broad than some of the definitions that we've dealt with previously in the course, but I think it's important to understand that going forward. And then the final definition is theory building, right? So this is the process or cycle by which these theories are generated, tested, and refined. So it's not just model building. It's not just, hypothesis testing. It's the iterative process of generating these theories, refining them, critiquing them, et cetera. So now that we kind of have a little background and, an understanding of these basic definitions, I want to take about 5 minutes to do a pretty common but very impactful design thinking exercise where we develop personas to understand some of these really common paradigms in organizational research. So the narrative that we're setting up is this boardroom meeting. So this is an organization that got, on a popular company rating website, got a pretty poor review for culture, for company culture, but they don't know why. So this man in the middle is the manager, and he brings in these individuals who he has determined have kind of some different perspectives and wants to discuss this culture issue in the organization. So before the meeting, he put them into 4 brackets. So he kind of, knowing these people and having worked with them, determined what type of person they were. So first he divided between objective and subjective perspectives. So, do they view things from an individual's point of view and having things that are different for each person's experience, which is more the subjective side, or is there some sort of objective structure and rule set to the organizational breakdown? And then the other element that he divided them on was radical change or regulation. Is this someone who understands and accepts the current structure of the organization, or is it someone who really wants to make a difference, make some changes, and bring in a kind of a new wave of thinking? So we'll start with our first persona, Bill the businessman. So he is a member of what is called the functionalist paradigm, which falls under the objective regulation quadrant of our plot. He went to Wharton Business School. He has risen through the ranks of this company by what he terms putting in the work. So he's done, countless hours. He's, done everything that he's supposed to do to get his promotion. And how he would define his kind of theory building technique is that he searches for regularities in the organizational structure so that he can predict and control them. So if he's looking for a promotion, he's searching for specific things that people can do that will always work, and he's going to do them and get the promotion. So how he wants to approach this culture issue is that he wants to review past company directives and search for information about culture within them, and then develop hypotheses that he can test. The next persona is Mary the Millennial. So she's a member of what's called the interpretive paradigm, which is subjective and regulation, that quadrant. She double majored in psychology and marketing, and being a female, she aspires to break that glass ceiling at her company that has a traditionally male executive board. Her kind of theory building approach is that she wants to describe and explain what's going on around her so that she can diagnose and understand it. So she's not necessarily looking to make changes, but she just wants to understand things from each individual's perspective. So she's very, very people oriented. So she suggests that we should interview employees and understand their individual experiences with the culture of the organization. And it's also important to understand some of the similarities that these personas have. So she really admires Bill and the process that he took to get to where he is, and hopes to be in a similar position one day. The next is Patti the Protester. So she's part of what's called the radical humanist paradigm, which is subjective and looks for radical change. She graduated from UCLA with a degree in sociology and was a protester in the Vietnam War protests in the 60s. She describes and critiques what's going on around her in the organization because she wants to drive change in the organization by revising people's consciousness. So her idea for this issue is to bring in employees to the team that have been discriminated within the organization, people that can tell their story and can really identify areas of change that might be good for those individual people. And she appreciates Mary the Millennial and respects that she has, that she identifies these differing experiences of the workers. And finally, we have Corey the Conspiracist. So he is a member of the radical structuralist paradigm, which falls under the objective radical change quadrant. So he dropped out of college because, of course, higher education is a scam, and he thinks that COVID-19 is a Chinese bioweapon. But despite that, he does have a very unique perspective on theory building. And what he wants to do is identify sources of domination within the organization and persuade people to kind of adopt some revolutionary practices and really kind of change the structure. So he suggests something a little more extreme and believes that the people in charge at the top of this organization are the ones who have deliberately created this objective structure of domination, and wants to ask for the resignation because of this intentional creation of a culture that pacifies their employees. So what he appreciates about Patti the Protester is that she really is looking for change as well, and he wants to collude with her to bring in a new wave of management. So, we have Matt then, and he's the manager, and he needs to try and understand how he can comprehend the differences, similarities, and interrelationships of these 4 employees that he's brought in. And he uses a method of doing this called meta-triangulation. And this allows him to look at these multiple paradigms, start to bridge the gap, appreciate the commonalities and the differences and come to a comprehensive and very valuable point of view. So meta-triangulation has 3 phases. The first phase is groundwork. So this is kind of the phase that Matt and our personas are in right now. So he starts by defining the phenomena of interest. So the problem with this is, we've done a lot of this in our own research, but when you look at a multi-paradigm perspective, the legitimacy of a question might vary across paradigms. So Bill maybe wants to know, what about the culture is driving inefficiencies? Whereas Patti is not worried about inefficiencies or managerial perspectives. She wants to know how to change the culture in order to increase employee satisfaction. So those differences create kind of a disconnect between what this phenomenon of interest should be. So Matt really has to work in defining a broad and interpretable phenomena of interest and research questions that will appeal to each of the 4 employees. The second part of phase 1 is focusing these paradigm lenses. So this is what he did prior to the meeting. So the first thing he did was bracket the paradigm. So look at where the boundaries are, look at what assumptions people are making, what perspectives they're coming from. And then moving on from that, he aims to identify transition zones. So that's where the similarities are. So what's interesting about paradigms is that, people think of them as often strict, closed-in structures. But in reality, the boundaries that are present in paradigms are quite flexible and fluid. So by identifying those transition zones, you can begin to bridge the gap between different paradigms and help to kind of create this multi-paradigm perspective. And then once you have those paradigm lenses, the important part is to collect a meta-theoretical sample. So there's a couple ways to do this. You want data that appeals to each of the paradigms that you're considering in your theory building process. One method that some people employ is to collect different data for each lens. So maybe Bill wants kind of to take an econometric approach. So he wants to look at employee productivity and turnover and maybe hours worked for the employees. Whereas Patti or Mary really wants to do some case studies. They want to interview people. They want to understand the differences that people have within the organization. So this is used by some people, but more ideally for meta-triangulation, you really want a common data source because this can help better facilitate comparisons. One example of a meta-theoretical sample that works really well in this context are case studies. Oftentimes case studies are very broad and they can accent extremes. They're also open to interpretation and can be utilized by various paradigms and the people who are members of those paradigms. So that's phase 1, which is the groundwork. So phase 2 is the data analysis, right? So this is kind of something that, in normal theory building, this is something that might be kind of second nature, right? We each have our set methodologies. They have their very specific steps. We know them, like the back of our hand, and we go through and analyze the data however we're used to doing. But in multi-paradigm perspectives, it's a little different. So what you need to do first is plan a paradigm itinerary. So you're going to be looking at the data through the lens of each paradigm. And you want to know the order in which you're going to do that. And the reason is insights from previous analyses will have some sort of influence on the analyses that you do afterwards. By having an itinerary and having an intentional ordering of those lenses that you're going to use for analyzing, you can become more aware of this influence and then build a better contrasting image while you do it. So this itinerary is a very important step in structuring your analysis process. The second part of phase 2 is to conduct multi-paradigm coding. So what you want to do is you take your data, you want to break it down, interpret it, and conceptualize it. So this really helps to break down the data into very specific pieces that can be utilized by the different paradigms. And because these different paradigms have different assumptions, they're inherently using different methods to analyze data. So how you address this is twofold. First, similar to how anyone would address data, you have to become very intimate with it. You have to know it inside and out. And then once you are very, very familiar with it, then you start to impose these alternative spins. So I'm looking at how the data could be used by, Corey versus Mary. How are they going to take case studies, for example, if that's the data that we've chosen, to address their own perspectives and needs throughout the theory building process. And then finally, you want to write paradigm accounts. So this does a number of things. It brings understanding of the paradigms and creates a cohesive representation of those paradigms. It also helps you to, it deepens your own understanding of the paradigms that you're using by utilizing what's called language in use of the specific paradigm. And finally, it helps you to focus accounts on the different themes that span across paradigms. So you can start to identify those bridges and really incorporate them into your theory building process. So then finally, phase 3 of meta-triangulation is theory building. So the first step to theory building is exploring meta-conjectures. So within our own research, and throughout the semester, we've looked at conjectures and propositions for our own research. And the difference with a multi-paradigm approach is that the propositions have to be interpretable from multiple paradigms. So one way you can do this is through conjecture inversion. So this is where you start with a very broad question, and then you begin to reframe that question from the perspective of each lens that you're dealing with. And then the second way to do this is through conversion techniques. So this is where you really probe the debates and contradictions between our paradigms, so that you can begin to build kind of a more comprehensive view of what you're actually studying and come up with ways in which you can justify those contradictions across paradigms. So after you come up with your meta-conjectures, then you really get to the heart of all of meta-triangulation, which is attaining a meta-paradigm perspective. So where your perspective on your phenomena of interest truly spans across paradigms. And this kind of broadens the normal idea of theory and allows you to show a coherent understanding that's very diverse and can accommodate these different paradigms. It also helps you to recognize how conflicting but interdependent paradigm insights can begin to work with each other and interplay. That's kind of the meat of meta-triangulation itself. And then finally, what's important with this last step, and I think that this is something that's worth mentioning, this meta-triangulation method is often taught and displayed in a very linear fashion. And it's not always the case that the steps are very linear like that. So our last step is articulating critical self-reflection, and in reality, this is something that should be occurring throughout the entire process. You should be, really reflecting on what you're doing throughout the process and adjusting as needed. So the issue with this is that for general theory building, we often focus on validity and internal consistency to kind of evaluate our theory. But the problem with this is that it really focuses on reducing diversity, which is exactly what we're building in a multi-paradigm perspective. So what we want to do here is expand our criteria of evaluation to things such as creativity, relevance, and comprehensiveness, which better address the multi-paradigm theory process. So those are our 3 phases. So let's go back a little bit to Matt and our 4 personas. So Matt has called these 4 people in. He's bracketed them into their respective quadrants of this plot. And he has an aerial view of this. So he is able to, look at these 4 people, understand their perspectives and ways of thinking, and can really start to address the phenomenon of culture and start to come up with what questions they want to answer, what things they want to study. Now, what's important about this figure that I've presented here is that, Matt does have an aerial view, which is very beneficial, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have a paradigm of his own. So I positioned him kind of intentionally up to the right here to imply that maybe he does come from a similar paradigm to Corey the Conspiracist, for example. So maybe, while he may not be as extreme as Corey, he does kind of take this objective radical change point of view. And that's important to recognize as you are doing a multi-paradigm account. And that's because, you know, the influence that you're even subconsciously putting on your analysis process is going to affect your results. So often what is useful is to have people in this aerial view that also come from separate paradigms themselves. So, you know, maybe Matt wants to bring in another manager who takes more of an approach that, you know, Mary the Millennial would take, maybe someone younger and more in line with her, so that they can both have this aerial view and can go through this meta-triangulation process together. And that's how you really develop quality and quality theory that lends quite a bit of contribution to the area in which you're studying. So that is kind of the summation of you know, the first two papers that I have, you know, dealing with multi-paradigm and you know, the meta-triangulation. But I would love to answer any questions at this time. And then if we do have a couple minutes, I do have kind of a Q&A activity that should only take a minute or two if we have time and if you'd like to.